The Pentagon ordered us to make an operational suitability test of the distant early warning line, the DEW line, running from Point Barrow, Alaska, 3,000 miles across northern Canada to Frobisher Bay and Cape Dyer. We made several 10,000-mile flights coming up to Fairbanks, Point Barrow, across the DEW line, down the coast of Labrador, a line of radars, 8 of them, which we call pole vault. We would RON at Tor Bay, Newfoundland, and then RON the next day at Montreal, Quebec, Canada, Royal Canadian Air Force Headquarters, to give them a briefing. We would always go to the Dixie Hotel in New York City and have meetings with Bell Telephone Lab reps from Whippany, New Jersey, who designed the DEW line, and with General Electric headquarters, 220 Church Street, New York City, who built the DEW line, and with Federal Electric tech rep from Paramus, New Jersey, who had a contract to operate the distant early warning line. We were to make an operational suitability test of the man-machine combination, the DEW line. Colonel Bill Potter was our leader in Alaska, and we borrowed 2 wings of Yellowtail B-47s out of Biggs Field, El Paso, Texas, ran them up the international date line close to Russia, pretty far north, turned them around, and they penetrated the DEW line, acting as the enemy. General Electric riffed Colonel Bill Potter because they didn't like what we were finding out bad about the DEW line, and he told them so. He was riffed for reasons of economy, so he had no recourse. In '58, I was made operations officer for the operational suitability test of the DEW line. I spent the summer of '58 at Cambridge Bay, Victoria Island, Mackenzie District, Northwest Territories, Canada. We got 2 wings of B-52s out of Westover, Massachusetts, and Loring Air Force Base, Limestone, Maine. We ran them up to Goose Bay, over to Greenland at Bluey West 8, up to Thule, Greenland, across to Resolute, almost the top of the world, and then had them turn and penetrate the DEW line in the Cam Fox area of Canada. I made many flights with Wheeler Dorvell Airlines while I was there in Canada during my time off. I made many walks across the tundra with Peter Komigiak, a local Eskimo, with his family. And I had 8 or 10 men strung up and down the DEW line from east to west. I went to the Royal Canadian policeman and the Royal Canadian Mounties, asked him for information. They said no whiskey, and if your troops fool around with the girls, they might be married on the spot, or else take them to Florida with them as their wife. Otherwise, they make an allotment to the girl for life or 20 years or something like that. So we got along pretty well. I instructed the operators at the distant DEW line stations to keep their scope cameras running 24 hours a day. That was 16mm film. And one day Wheeler Dorvell came up missing. The people I'd been flying with, nice people flying a C-47 all over northern Alaska and Canada. Royal Canadian Air Force come in to make a search and rescue, and they got weathered in at Churchill. So I called over to Fox, where the Wheeler Dorvell plane last landed, and said, develop your radar scope film. The radar scope film, when developed, showed that Wheeler Dorvell was airborne, flew 160 miles northwest towards Igloo Lick, where he went off the edge of our scope. I knew from flying that Goonie Bird 20 years in the Air Force and as being instructor pilot that if he went 160 miles, the engines running, didn't make any call of trouble, then he got to Igloo Lick. We notified Igloo Lick to send out the Eskimos with dog teams and search the perimeter. Within a few hours, they found a crashed C-47. One passenger had survived intact. He got the crew out who had multiple fractures, drug them in the back, put them in a sleeping bag, kept them warm for 24 hours until we got them out of there. But we made that rescue in effect by using radar film, which I had running 24 hours a day and had no intention of developing. we made a rescue without having to go on a long search while the Royal Canadian Air Force was weathered in at Churchill. This part of the new land test was in 57 and 58, mostly 58, when we had the IGY, International Geophysical Year. We had those people on the DuLand too making pictures of the Aurora Borealis. They did that in the winter. We were there mostly in the summer. On July the 4th, I went out fishing with a little string the Eskimos gave me with a bent nail on the end, a piece of red ribbon. I would drop that down 30 feet into the water while standing on an ice cake and come up with all kind of codfish. The people there, I was told, were fairly primitive. They hadn't usually seen white men except the Canadian Northern Affairs agents until the DuLand was built. I went to a Church of England ministers meeting and Sunday services. He gave it first in English for me and then in Inupiat for the Eskimos. It was a very interesting flight. We saw country that had been almost primitive territory until we built the DuLand there. Canadians furnished the tundra and the Americans furnished the money. And we had to hire Canadian raditions for the Canadian part and pay them $800 a month. We paid the raditions in Alaska $1,100 a month. The Canadian government put that stipulation on there. They didn't want their economy inflated with too high prices. Now this is the composite of several flights we made going both ways, clockwise and counterclockwise, 10,000-mile flights. And when we were on the ground or during the summer when I was at Cambridge Bay, Victoria Island, I got an opportunity to photograph the birds, the flowers, the Eskimos, the DuLand station. And these pictures were made in 1957, 1958, 40 years ago, because this is 1998.
Ground Center to conduct a test of the DuLand, the distant early warning line, a chain of some 50 radar stations stretching across the frozen Arctic and a 3,000-mile arc from Cape Lisburne in Alaska to Baffin Island in eastern Canada. The Eglin Air Force Base test team proceeded in the summer of 1947 by C-47 to the Powell Bar area, the Point Barrow border island area of northern Alaska. In the event of an enemy attack coming across the polar waste, the distant early warning line will flash word rearward to the combat ops centers at NORAD and the Royal Canadian Air Force headquarters in Montreal. This time gain could spell the difference between a national disaster or successful repelling of the enemy for Canada and the United States. Traveling at the speed of sound, a jet bomber would require about an hour to fly between the DuLand and its nearest target in the United States or Canada. During this 1 hour warning period, the United States or Canada would have time to get interceptor aircraft airborne to repel the enemy or to send off retaliatory bombers. The DuLand has a dial telephone system stretching from one end to the other. One can stand in the station at Cape Dyer, Baffin Island, and by dialing 62 repeatedly can talk to people on the western end of the line, and by connection through the White Alice system can talk to Fairbanks and other points. There's now a chain of airstrips from one end of the Arctic to the other. As one flies across the Canadian and the Alaskan Arctic, one is seldom more than 25 miles from an airstrip. And from the lights of friendly people. One is never out of sight. The two long rows of modules indicates a main station. These two long modules have a crosswalk overhead, built this way to avoid drifting snow. The large round dome houses the search radar. The tall two-colored tower is the antenna tower for the Doppler detection system. Dual-line radar cannot cope with the ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. However, a realistic evaluation of the threat indicates that manned bombers will be our chief threat at least until or beyond 1960. Meanwhile, researchers are working on a long-range radar system to counter the ICBM. Just west of Point Barrow, Alaska is the sandbar where Will and Wiley Post made their last takeoff. And just above the sandbar, a small monument marks this spot. The distant early warning line was conceived in 1952 by a group of scientists meeting at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They reasoned that the nation was most vulnerable across the frozen Arctic waste. Therefore, the radar alarm net was to be built across northern Canada and Alaska. There was a prototype station built at Streator, Illinois. A later similar model built at Barter Island, Alaska, with auxiliary stations on each side. And from the elimination of bugs from these stations, the present dual-line concept of a long train of modules was conceived. The Arctic has always had difficulty in transmitting radio signals. There are always the aurora borealis, the changing ionosphere, violent storms, magnetic disturbances, to such extent that the Arctic has long been an Arctic no man's land. Static blotted out conventional radio signals as often as not, and important messages could be delayed for several days. Summertime in the Arctic brings flowers and birds and caribou, and the unwelcome mosquito. In the summertime, the snow disappears for a short summer. The Arctic tundra bursts forth brown, partly green later on, and the caribou appear from the Brooks Range. Driven down in search of food and driven towards the Beaufort Sea, trying to escape the stings of the mosquito. One day in Pile 3, there were over 5,000 caribou casually strolling through the station a warm afternoon. While the summer, which is extremely short, sometimes finds days reaching as high as 60 degrees temperature. Generally, the temperature will stay around freezing. This is in the summer months, with not too much sunshine, generally low stratus overcast, with quite often a light, misty rain. The Arctic tundra is usually a few feet of moss, spongy growth of living plant life underlain by sheets or lenses of ice, quite often mixed with rocks and snow. The midnight sun from Barter Island. The sun is far to the north, shining with the red haze underneath the straightest overcast. It is midnight, and most places to the south you would think it would be dark. June and July, part of August, you find the sun going round and round, never setting. North of the Brooks Range in Alaska, there is usually about 20 to 25 inches of snow, the equivalent of about 5 inches of rainfall. Now, considering the Sahara Desert gets about 10 inches of rainfall, one might say that the Arctic is a semi-desert country. The Eglin Field test team assembled in the summer of 1958 to run an operational suitability test on the dew line. Colonel George L. Jones says goodbye to the test team as they warm up their C-47 for the flight to the Arctic. Part of the team proceeding to Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and from thence to Cambridge Bay. Part of the team going eastward to Newfoundland, Labrador, Baffin Island, over to Hall Lake, and across to the Cam Fox area. On one flight to the Arctic in February of 1958, the Eglin Field test team traveled approximately 10,000 miles in 22 days in their C-47. Leaving Eglin Field, temperature was about 50 to 60 degrees. Proceeding northward to Great Falls, Montana, Edmonton, Alberta, up through the frozen North Country, through the Yukon Territory, eventually crossing over into Anchorage, and after briefing Alaskan Air Command, proceeding northward across the Brooks Range to the dew line. Following the dew line, low-frequency homing beacons are on across to Baffin Island. The team proceeded southward across the wet and stormy coast of Labrador, down to Newfoundland, back to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and back to Florida. At times, temperatures as low as 60 below zero were encountered. As one comes into Alaska, one encounters the Alaska Range, actually an extension of the Rocky Mountains. As one goes further north, the tree line gradually recedes until it is almost sea level. And the mountains in this country are mostly rock and ice with nothing around but cold air. What bit of sparse timber or coverage is found is usually down in the valleys. About 2/3 of Canada is underlain by permafrost. And on one occasion in Point Barrow, while drilling for a second gas well to heat the camp, we found that the permafrost was over 1,000 feet thick. How much further down these sheets of ice go, one can only surmise. In Fairbanks, they probably have more per capita light planes on skis in the wintertime and floats in the summer than most cities in the United States. Proceeding westward from Fairbanks, we get an aerial view of the University of Alaska. Student body, approximately 500 students, mostly boys. For about 7 months out of the year, you will find snow on the ground, with occasionally a few snow showers in the summertime. And then you have 5 short months of spring-like summer. Proceeding northward from Fairbanks, we fly through the Brooks Range. Just north of the Brooks Range, on the Arctic slopes, we ran into some caribou, leaving trails on the snow. These animals subsist on moss and willow sprouts, pawing through the snow for whatever morsel of food they might find. Midwinter finds the dew line stations well frozen in, with a continual battle on their hands to keep the airstrips open, to keep the roadways clear, to keep blocks of ice cut and crushed for the ice melter to furnish drinking water and water for toilet facilities. Proceeding eastward across the dew line in February of 1958, we found a temperature inversion over most of the route. While the surface temperature upon landing would usually be about 50 to 60 below zero, as soon as one climbs to 4,000 or 5,000 feet, the temperature will suddenly rise to about 20 below zero, which, relatively speaking, seems fairly warm. In February, there are a few hours of daylight. The dark winter of November and December and January has finished. During these 3 months, the sun never comes up, and there's continual darkness. At noon, there's a dusky twilight to the south, which soon fades back into blackness. Wintertime, the dew line sites become encrusted with frost and snow. The radome has a mantle of snow on top, the tops of the buildings, the 30-foot lateral UHF dishes, which works the telephone system and the teletype, the tall Doppler tower. All of these become encrusted with frost and snow. The basic dew line module is 28 feet long, 10 feet high, and 16 feet wide, with connecting doors arranged such that these modules can be bolted together, 50 or 60 of them, so that you have a main station. These long trains of modules have been known to withstand winds of forces up to 130 miles per hour. Some of the old Quonset huts and tents still remain on the sites which remain from the contractor days. Chopping a hole through 7 feet of ice, we tried our luck at fishing. The dew line was built in approximately 32 months. The line became operational in July of 1957. On all of the dew line sites, there are Eskimos employed as laborers. Beginning wages are $250 a month, with quarters and rations for 3 furnished, with upgrades in pay, the Eskimo can make as much as $500 per month with food and housing furnished. Some of the Eskimos have as many as 6 or 7 children, so this ration for 3 may have to be supplemented with a bit of seal or walrus hunting or duck hunting. The Eskimos in Canada are wards of the Canadian government. They have a Northern Affairs official at most large Eskimo villages to keep an eye on the native population. They find that these people are extremely susceptible to tuberculosis, with the common cold doing great damage and even killing these people, with measles usually being in epidemic proportions when it gets started, and generally with a great loss of life. The dog team is still the Eskimos' main method of transportation. The Eskimo family comes to the Hudson's Bay store in Canada for their food. Prices usually run about 3 or 4 times what we would pay in the stateside. There is no fresh milk, no fresh fruit, no fresh vegetable, only a few canned goods. A bottle of ketchup would sell for 50 or 60 cents. The DEW line is manned mostly by civilian personnel working for the Federal Electric Corporation. And oddly enough, most of these people are married, about 3/4 of them. Their main reason for being in the Arctic is money. Money to pay off their mortgage, put the children through school. The DEW line furnishes quarters which are snug and clean. Each man has a private room. There are good toilet facilities, showers, electric washers, and dryers. There are 3 doctors and 3 dentists on the DEW line to safeguard the health of the over 700 DEW liners. There are 6 chaplains on the DEW line who go from station to station. There are 2 Catholic, 2 Jewish, and 2 Protestant chaplains. The Eskimo people do not, as some people think, live in ice igloos. On the contrary, you'll find them in a little clapboard building, varying from almost nothing to, in some cases, a fairly elaborate house. Generally, though, the Eskimo house will be built out of old packing crates or lumber salvaged from wherever they can find it. While the Eskimo can work up to $500 a month, the radition, or the combination radar scope operator and technician, begins at $850 a month in Canada or $1,050 a month in Alaska. The sector superintendent earns $17,000 a year. Food and shelter are supplied for free. A normal tour is 18 months, with approximately 15 months of this time in the Arctic. If a man fulfills his contract, he gets a bonus of about $1,500. Starving for sunshine and warmth, when these men get their vacation at the end of 9 months, they generally fly as far south as Jamaica, Cuba, or even Central America. The DEW line has truly opened the Arctic to further exploration. One is never more than 5 to 10 minutes from an airstrip as you fly from one side of the North American continent to the other side. The Arctic has been remote for centuries. It is now opened up to exploration. The white man has invaded the Arctic in force. His know-how, his education, his civilization.